What is going on with the new Air Force One aircraft? These planes, who have already been built, were originally supposed to enter service next year, but after multiple delays, now they're not expected before 2026 at the earliest. So what is it that's taking so long? Stay tuned. To start off with, I have a bit of trivia for you. There is one small detail in the paint scheme of the current Air Force One aircraft that would not be legal if these jets were normal airliners. Can you guess what it is? Think about it, and I'll get back to it later in the video. The Boeing 747 is unquestionably the second most distinctive airliner ever, after obviously the Concorde. But probably the most distinctive 747 of them all is not actually an airliner, it is this aircraft. Or rather these aircraft that we usually refer to as Air Force One. And before people start writing in the comments, yes, I know that Air Force One is not the proper name of these jets. Air Force One is a call sign that applies to any aircraft of the US Air Force when the President of the United States is on board. When he is on board an aircraft belonging to another military branch, like a helicopter of the US Marines for example, that aircraft then uses the call sign Marine One. And of course, the history of American presidential aircraft doesn't begin with the current 747s. US presidents have had dedicated aircraft for their transport needs since even before the Second World War. However, the US president occasionally uses other aircraft as well, especially when he wants to keep a low profile. For example, the current president recently flew over to Europe in a Boeing C-32, which is a military 757, in order to visit Ukraine unannounced. The aircraft types that have been dedicated to the presidential role include the Boeing 314 Flying Boat, the military versions of the Douglas DC-4 and DC-6, as well as the Lockheed C-121 Constellation. And it was actually these Lockheed Constellations that were the first aircraft to use the call sign Air Force One. After the Lockheed Constellation, Air Force One entered into the jet age with an aircraft based on the 707 called the VC-137C. That aircraft was then used until the late 1980s, and it was actually the first presidential plane to use the livery that we know today, but we're going to talk more about that later. The current presidential aircraft entered service back in 1990, and its official designation is the VC-25 Alpha, and they're actually based on the Boeing 747-200 Bravo models, well, sort of. When these two special jets were built back in the 1980s, Boeing had already begun transitioning to the production of the newer 747-300. And that meant that the current presidential VC-25 Alpha indeed has the same fuselage of a 747-200, but from the start it also incorporated some features from the 747-300, like the updated General Electric CF6 engines that would also come to power the 747-400. But obviously, this is not the only unique things with the current Air Force One. There are other features that also set these planes apart from any other regular Boeing 747 operated as airliners. One example is that the VC-25 Alpha has the ability to take on fuel in flight via a refueling receptacle in its nose just below the cockpit. But in practice though, it seems that this feature hasn't been used much. By contrast, the plane has another unique feature that is being used almost all the time, which is built-in air stairs of a similar design to those that some early 737-200 combi models had. The VC-25 Alpha actually has two doors with air stairs, but unlike the 737, which obviously sits much lower to the ground, the air stairs in the Air Force One will not get you directly to what would be the main passenger deck. The Air Force One doesn't really use its cargo hold just for cargo, so this wasn't a big problem. It could be retrofitted as an entrance instead. Whenever a US president makes an official visit and a red carpet ceremony is called for, he normally uses the 747's regular L1 passenger door to get in and out of his plane. But away from the cameras, or when he's in a hurry, the president and his entourage can just use those air stairs, which is, pretty logical when you think about it. Obviously, there are many more differences and features in these jets, like military communications, data links and self-defense systems that we basically know nothing about. One thing that we do know is that until 9/11, the two planes didn't have the ability to transmit live video, but that was fixed with a later update. In fact, the two VC-25 Alphas are getting updated all the time, and you could almost date their photos and videos just by looking at the number of antennas and bumps sticking out of their fuselage. But no matter how many upgrades you do, these jets are now getting old and too expensive to run, with spare parts becoming harder and harder to find. So the plane that has been chosen to replace the VC-25 Alpha is the VC-25 Bravo, which is based on the 747-8i. In order to try and keep the cost of this contract low, Boeing is using two already built 747-8s, converting them into this new role. But that might turn out to have been a mistake, because as one engineer put it, the whole program will cost them way more than if they would have just started from scratch. And I'll tell you exactly why that is after this. What is actually the best way to learn maths and physics, you might wonder? Well, in my view, one of them is definitely Brilliant, today's sponsor. Brilliant is an interactive platform with thousands of courses ranging from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, computer science, and much, much more. Whether you're a student interested in aviation or a pilot looking to brush up on your understanding of aerodynamics, the gravitational physics course on Brilliant is a great way to deepen your knowledge. This course covers everything from Newton's law of gravity, the study of forces on objects and their resulting motion through the air, and much more. I've tried it myself, and because it's so interactive, it makes the learning experience both fun and engaging, which is why even my kids are huge fans of Brilliant. Each course is designed for high-velocity learning to help you stay focused and reach your goals fast. So to try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, you can visit brilliant.org/mentor now, or click on the link here in the description. The first 200 of you who does that will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription, and you'll also help supporting my work. Now, let's continue. Now, some of you might be wondering, why does the US president need to travel in a 747 in the first place? Okay, maybe there weren't many other good options back in the 1980s, but what about now? Wouldn't a newer and more modern design like the 777 or the 787 be a better choice? Well, since this is essentially a military aircraft used in a very specific role, we can't really know all of the reasons why the Air Force chose the 747. But we do know that the number of engines was a big factor in their decision. For airliners, we normally think of redundancy as a way to ensure that planes are safe in case of malfunctions. But modern jet engines have proven so reliable that twin-engine jets now fly for extended periods over open oceans with no worries whatsoever. But the US military has its own considerations for the planes that are going to carry the president, and one of them is that this aircraft might well need to stay in the air even after losing an engine, where a civilian aircraft would just try to immediately go for a diversion. Describing its reasoning to the public, the Air Force said that a twin-engine jet that loses an engine needs to land as soon as possible, whereas a four-engine aircraft would need to land as soon as practical. Building on that idea, back in the 1980s, when the current aircraft was selected, the Air Force wanted something with at least 3 engines. The two candidates back then were the DC-10 and the Boeing 747, and obviously the Boeing 747 won. The number of engines then remained as a big sticking point for the US Air Force when the next aircraft was selected, although initially at least, Boeing also offered the 787 as an option. But back in 2015, the discussions between Boeing and the Air Force were for the purchase of 2 completely new aircraft. The idea to use 2 existing 747-8s instead came when Boeing renegotiated the contract in 2017 after the then new president took office. Actually, already the year before that renegotiation, the Air Force and Boeing were looking at ways to reduce the cost of the program. And one such decision was to omit the requirement for mid-air refueling, for example, since, like I mentioned before, it wasn't really being used anyway. This also made sense since the Air Force One only has to carry a fraction of the number of passengers of a typical 747, often less than 100 people, making its range way greater than of a normal aircraft. And of course, the newer 747-8 has more efficient engines and therefore an even longer range, satisfying the full needs of the military. Eventually, Boeing signed a new fixed-price contract for $3.9 billion, covering 2 VC-25 Bravo aircraft that would now be built modifying 2 existing 747-8 passenger jets instead of factory new ones. Boeing just happened to have 2 of these jets in storage because it originally built them for Transaero, a Russian airline that went bust back in 2015 before Boeing had a chance to deliver them. The US Air Force was okay with this since the 2 jets were basically new anyway. Boeing obviously liked this plan because finding another buyer for these passenger-carrying 747-8s back in 2017 would have likely been really difficult. So using them this way was seen as a no-brainer, a win-win, right? Well, as it turns out, the answer to this is a giant no for a number of reasons. First of all, something as complex as an airliner needs a lot of time, a lot of space, and a lot of people to completely take apart and put back together again, which is what needs to be done for a conversion as fundamental as this one. Even with normal airliners, the cost of a D-check, which is basically a complete overhaul of an aircraft, is so high that many airlines don't plan to keep their planes that long in order to avoid having to do it. They prefer to replace the aircraft with new ones instead, which is not that much more expensive actually. Boeing has had some really painful experience of this recently when they had to check and rework hundreds of 787s because of possible faults between the joints in their composite fuselages, as I have explained in a previous video. To its dismay, Boeing found when doing this that these checks cost about as much as it would have cost them just to build new aircraft because they had to be completely stripped down. Not only that, this work required a lot of space and, of course, a lot of skilled engineers that had to be pulled away from the production of new jets. Boeing now faces a repeat of this 787 rework challenge with the build of the 2 bespoke presidential VC-25 Bravos. Except that this challenge is mounting up to be even worse, since the engineers that can work on presidential planes need to undergo some pretty serious vetting and security checks before they can do so. And that also means that if one or more of these engineers would have to be called away to other Boeing projects, which actually they often did, then all of the work had to stop because it was impossible for Boeing to replace these engineers at short notice. This fact has obviously introduced even more delays, and with every delay comes a further cost increase. But at this point, some of you might ask, why was any of this a surprise to Boeing? Surely Boeing knows what it takes to strip down, overhaul and generally work on an aircraft even of this size and complexity. Sure, these jets need extensive rework, including structural components like the installation of those extra doors and the air stairs, but Boeing knew this too, so what's the problem? Well, the answer here might actually surprise you. It's 250 miles or 400 kilometers of wire. That's how much electrical wiring each VC-25 Bravo will have by the time that they're ready. Of course, this wasn't a surprise for Boeing either, but one thing that Boeing didn't adequately account for was the fact that about 90% of the wiring that these 747-8s had used previously had to be removed and replaced. And just as importantly, the new wiring couldn't always go in the same places where the old wiring had gone. You see, when new aircraft is being assembled, before each fuselage section is being joined together, workers can fill each section with things like hydraulic lines and wiring. This is easier to do at that stage when the plane is still in pieces. Then, as the sections are gradually joined together, electrical wires and other systems are also connected. As you can imagine, all of this is a lot harder and more time-consuming to do when the plane has already been put together, and that's not the only wiring-related problem here. One of the conditions in the VC-25 Bravo contract was that the 2 aircraft would need to be fully compliant with current FAA certification requirements for a new aircraft. Now, this was a bit odd since the jets will officially be military and therefore the FAA technically has no authority over this certification. However, the US Air Force had put this into the contract as a matter of procurement policy, just to be on the safe side basically. All of this might sound like typical boring contract mumbo jumbo, but it is not. It's actually very important and a major headache for Boeing. As John Ostrauer explained in the excellent Air Current, which I linked to below, what this meant was that Boeing could not simply certify the VC-25 Bravo as a variant of the existing 747. Even though we're talking about just 2 jets, Boeing will have to certify the VC-25 Bravos as if they were completely new designs. Now, you would think that for most of the certification documents and checks, this shouldn't be a huge deal. Boeing simply has to copy the certification paperwork that it already has from when it certified the 747-8 back in 2011, right? Well, almost. That process was an amended type certificate, building on the existing certification of previous 747 variants. But a lot of things have changed in the aircraft certification since 1970, when the original 747-100 entered service. And yes, one of those things is the wiring certification standard. Over time, new FAA rules have stipulated that wiring bundles of redundant systems has to have a minimum amount of separation between them. This was added for a very good reason, namely to ensure that a problem with one wire bundle couldn't affect the other nearby bundle. But when these rules were made stricter, they didn't apply to already certified aircraft. Now, sometimes manufacturers would still make changes to the wiring if specific problems were found or as a precaution after an accident or incident. But otherwise, previous wiring layouts could be grandfathered into the certification of newer aircraft. This matter was actually a factor in the return of the 737 MAX to service back in 2020. The aircraft's wiring and wire routing had no role in the tragic crashes of these aircraft, but to approve the type's return to service, the FAA and other aviation authorities insisted that Boeing updated the routing of several wire bundles to comply with these new rules, and Boeing obviously complied. For the new Air Force One, what all this means is that Boeing will need to reroute a lot of the wiring bundles in the jets. Plus, on top of that, the Air Force will also install a lot of new systems on board. Obviously, with their own wiring, and obviously the same separation rules will have to apply to these new bundles as well. According to the Air Current, Boeing seriously underestimated how extensive this new wiring was going to be. In the end, it actually turned out that the number of interfaces between the plane's normal electrics and systems and its new subsystems were more than double what Boeing first expected. Boeing has also had other, less important but still embarrassing and time-consuming issues with the program, including a dispute with a subcontractor that introduced even more delays. These events, plus the pandemic, have caused the cost of the program to go up by over $1 billion as of last year. And remember, this is a fixed price contract, so that extra billion will have to come straight out of Boeing's pockets, unless they can find some kind of loophole. For $1 billion extra, Boeing would really have been better off making completely new aircraft for the VC-25 Bravo program, rather than using those existing aircraft. Boeing's CEO, Dave Calhoun, has since said that with hindsight, Boeing probably shouldn't have agreed to this program under these terms. And apart from the Air Force One project, Boeing also have other fixed-price military contracts, including the KC-46 in-flight refueling tanker, which also has gone over budget. The most recent news about the Air Force One, though, involves its appearance. Because currently, the two aircraft have a livery designed by Raymond Loewy back in the 1960s, which he did with guidance and inspiration from Jackie Kennedy, who didn't like the military look that the planes were painted in back at that time. Those first 707-based VC-137Cs still had a lot of unpainted aluminium in their bellies, which the current Air Force One also has. The previous president had settled on a very different livery with a dark blue underside, but in a recent statement, the US Air Force said that such dark color would require more certification work with the FAA. In the end, the new livery that the Air Force presented recently is only a small update. The front of the belly of the plane will have a slightly different light blue, and the rest of the underbelly will be painted in a neutral color, because the aluminium alloys used in the 747-8 can't have a polished finish. Now, remember that bit of trivia that I asked you about in the beginning? What detail in the paint scheme of the current and even the future Air Force One would make it illegal for an airliner? Well, the answer is the doors. Airliners need to have a thick line around the frame of each door in contrasting color, making their location easy to find for firefighters and other rescue crew. But as you can see in any picture showing the plane with the doors closed, the current and future VC-25s don't have any marking around the doors. Obviously, this is just a small detail, but remember, the Air Force wants these planes to comply with FAA certification rules, so if the next Air Force One have contrasting lines around their doors when they enter service in 2026 or 27, well then you guys will know why. Finally, there is one other thing worth thinking about regarding Boeing, the US Air Force and military 747s. In addition to the President's VC-25, the Air Force also has a fleet of 4 E-4 Bravo Night Watch aircraft, better known as the Doomsday plane. These planes have special shielding and communication equipment to be used in case of a nuclear war. By the way, unlike what some TikTokers have been saying recently, if you see these planes flying, it doesn't mean that the world is about to end. They actually fly with quite some regularity whenever the president has to go overseas or sometimes just to move the US Secretary of Defense. But like the current Air Force One, these jets are 747-200 Bravos, with 3 out of 4 being over a decade older than the VC-25s are. The Air Force has stated that they will need to replace them eventually, for the same reasons that it's replacing the Air Force Ones. And the specification for the next Doomsday plane still call for, you guessed it, 4 engines. So with the production of the 747 now over, the question then becomes, where will these jets come from? Well, we don't know, but there are a few underused 747-8s out there that were originally configured as business jets. If the US Air Force wants to secure them, we will probably hear about it quite soon. Now, remember to check out the deal that my sponsor has offered in the link below. It really helps the channel, and get yourself some nice merch. Check out this video next or this playlist and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye bye.